Welcome back to the Kim-Renaud podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and this, of course, is part of the literature series of the Kim-Renaud podcast, which will be running throughout the summer, and of course, a huge reason why we have today's guest on the podcast, Immanuel Kim. Immanuel Kim is the Career Foundation and Kim-Renaud Associate Professor of Korean Literature and Cultural Studies at George Washington University. He is the author of two previous books, Right and Revolution, Women's Sexuality and Memory in North Korean Fiction, and Laughing North Koreans, Culture of the Film Industry. Both of which, of course, will be linked below, but today we're going to speak about his most recent release, which is a translation of a North Korean novel, which is Paek Nam-Nyong's Friend. This is a novel from the late 1980s, and it's wonderfully understated as a book. It comes about at a change in style in North Korean literature and propaganda. Social realism is being forced out. The idea of heroic struggle and sacrifice, of ordinary people overcoming the extraordinary, is just no longer doing the trick when it comes to engaging the masses. And so stories like Friend come along, which is an understated novel about family and divorce, with morality filtered in between the lines, not rammed down the reader's throats. But of course, so important about this novel is the insight you get into the North Korean mind and the North Korean publishing industry. As Immanuel writes, this is a state-sanctioned novel written in Korea for North Koreans by an author in good standing with the regime. An author in such good standing that Immanuel actually travelled to North Korea prior to publishing the book and met with him. There's a lot in this novel that will shock readers and surprise them. Most of what the uninitiated mind to North Korean literature expects is just not going to be found here. This novel leaves a lot unsaid. There's subtlety and careful composition. The focus is more on the everyday life of the individuals rather than the grand narrative of overcoming pain and suffering. And even then, the outcomes and solutions for the problems they're facing is still ambiguous, still left open for the reader to imagine and hope in certain directions. And I fear the more I speak about in this introduction, the more I'm going to give away in the novel and from Immanuel Kim's analysis. So I will leave it here, but of course I will link the book below, and I really do encourage listeners to go and read it for themselves. It's not just an insight into North Korean life, but it's an incredibly readable novel, as well as being incredibly entertaining. But of course from here out I will let Immanuel Kim explain it in detail. Now as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the Patreon or PayPal links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And all the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through his translation of Paek Nam-Nyong's Friend, this is Immanuel Kim. Immanuel Kim, welcome to the Kim-Renaud podcast.
Hello. So nice to be here.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to get you on. I've been looking forward to this interview because I read your book, your translation and your edit and your introduction of the book, Friend, a while ago, and it jumped straight out at me, and I knew I had to get you on in this series. But so before we get into it, I might get you to introduce yourself a little bit, your background, and of course that would bleed in a little bit to how we get to this book from North Korea.
Right. Okay. So my formal title is the Korea Foundation Kim-Renaud Associate Professor of Korean Literature and Culture Studies at the George Washington University. And my background is in North Korean literature and cinema. And the way I got into it was, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking into Korean literature, and Korean literature was always based in like South Korean literature. So I thought, well, what about North Korean literature? And that's how I jumped into it. And as I was doing my research in Korea, reading through all these different short stories and novels from the 1960s all the way to the 1990s, I'm not going to lie, it was tough, very tough to read through this. And a lot of the preconceived notion of what North Korean literature is really, was right in front of me. In other words, all the propaganda, all the sort of formulaic narratives. So I struggled a lot. And then I came across a lot of works from the 1980s, and that really opened up my eyes. And one of them was Friend. And that's why I basically devoted my energy into reading everything that Paek Nam-Nyong wrote. And I really just got to know a lot of the writers who were active in the 1980s. And they were all pretty similar in terms of style and technique. So there must have been some kind of cohort there that really worked together. And I was really appreciative of the 1980s. My dissertation was pretty much based on the works of the 1980s, not just Nam-Nyong, but other writers of the time.
Okay, so before we do jump into the detail here, and this is going to be a really fascinating look at this book, I might get you to, before we start, do a very brief introduction just to what the book is, just so listeners have a guidepost just to what we're speaking about. Now, of course, we will get back to the book in much more detail at the end, but yeah, just as a start, what is the book about?
Right. So the book is about divorce. It's a couple who just cannot get along anymore and comes to the courthouse and pleads to the judge to issue this divorce. And then, of course, like any North Korean literature, the judge, who is the main character, is working hard to keep the family unified because the family is a representation of the state, and a broken family would pretty much be a broken state, and he doesn't want that. So as a good, faithful, loyal North Korean citizen, he is going to do his best to keep a couple intact. And at the end of the novel, we're not sure if that actually happens. So that's the interesting intrigue there. But yes, the novel is simply about divorce.
And just before we do launch into that stuff, something you wrote in your introduction to this book, which is interesting and worth mentioning, of course, is that we often get access to North Korean literature and stories and film, etc., and we don't get them from people of good standing often defectors or people that have been purged, example. So I might get to just touch on that idea of when we read Friend, we're not just reading a story from North Korea, but we're reading a story from North Korea which is a state-sanctioned novel written by a North Korean who is in good standing with the regime.
That is correct, yes. And sure, the notion of divorce might be shocking, but it really isn't, because much like any society, North Korea has had many divorce cases. At one point, far more than South Korea in their early stages of the nation. At this point, South Korea has outpaced North Korea. But yeah, so divorce isn't necessarily an irregular idea or concept in North Korea. Generally, the novel is about the judge, the main character, doing his best to keep the family unified, because that is what a North Korean hero would do. A protagonist in North Korean literature would do his best to keep the nation intact. And again, the family is a representation of the nation. So yes, it's pretty typical. The story itself is not typical, but a hero trying to maintain family unity is something that we've seen in the past in North Korean literature.
And something interesting before we do get here, this is, you write, this is really interesting, that in some ways this era and this book is a new change in the face of North Korean literature. It's a change away from social realism and in a new direction. So what is social realism, and what was the new direction that books like Friend was trying to take?
Right. So if you look at the formula of socialist realism, it's not only the theme, the location, in other words, the farms or the industrial factories. We're looking at character types. And a lot of these socialist realist characters, unlike the Soviet Union that had a far more nuanced characters, a lot of these socialist realist characters in early period of North Korean literature was pretty much flat characters, right? Maybe occasionally you'll have some rounded characters, but for the most part, if you're a revolutionary, then your mind is completely for the country, for the leader, for the party, and nothing will derail your purpose in life. And then you'll have your obvious villains as well, namely those from Japan or the United States or your South Korean lackeys. But generally, North Koreans will not have any faults. But as we get into the 80s, we get far more nuanced characters, nuanced stories, themes, and the narrative structure sort of changes from the 60s and 70s. And it's a far more intriguing read than it was in the past. And there are many reasons why that happened as well. But yeah, for the most part, yes, the 80s was a very exciting time in North Korea in terms of cultural products, cinema and literature, because these artists were opened to various materials from around the world. In other words, the party allowed it. And so they were exposed to all these different materials. And I believe they got a lot of inspiration from outside materials.
And so this judge, as you mentioned at the start, that we're talking about a divorce case and a husband and a wife and a child involved, and the judge is here in the court case. And one of the things that really echoes through the prose is the idea that the judge, as much as he's concerned about the family unit, he's concerned about the strength of the state. And I might here to touch on this idea of how he treats it, because in the beginning, as you said, you get both couples before the judge speaking to them, and the judge really pries into their lives. He goes to their home, he talks to their son, he goes to their workplaces, and he thinks and he ponders and he agonizes over this. And the theme that seems to run through a lot of this novel is the idea that this idea of the function of the family and the stability and the strength of the family is in fact the stability of the North Korean state itself.
Yeah, so for North Koreans reading this novel, they will consider the judge as a very compassionate character, someone who goes beyond his job duties and really goes the full 9 yards and just to keep a family intact. It's a very admirable quality. Again, something that North Koreans, when they read this, they'll probably feel very moved by it. Whereas maybe people outside of North Korea might find him a little bit creepy, right? So, and I don't disagree with that. There is a sense of creepiness, because it's just because no one in like the Western capitalist world, no judge would ever really do that, because that is literally outside of his job duties. But no, here it's a compassionate judge, but it also reflects the national campaign at the time, which is the Hidden Hero campaign. And that's basically saying, unlike the 60s and 70s, where you have these strong, infallible, revolutionary heroes, by the 80s, we're talking about the everyday person who is just trying his best to work hard for the country. And here is the judge, who's just an average guy, recognizes that this is a moment for him to really help this family, but also, as you say, to show the strength of the country. So he goes out of his way, because that is exactly what a hidden hero would do during this period in the 80s. So yeah.
And so also on that same theme, it seems a lot of the focus on the suffering here is on the child involved, the child of the couple. So very interestingly, both parties in this divorce, they're both very stuck in their ways. They're both very embittered after many years of drifting apart. And of course, the judge is trying to bring them back together and show that perhaps they've made mistakes and there's still love there. But he keeps pointing to the fact that if I divorce you two, it's going to be catastrophic on your son. And also, in a way of showing just how morally upright the two involved are, the husband and wife, despite their fighting, they always have concern for their son. They're always worried about the son and think they're doing the wrong thing by him, despite this stuff. So I might get open that idea that a large focus in this novel is the place of children, and children, it feels like children being the future of the nation.
Absolutely. So that would be a correct way of reading this novel, right? The children are the future of the country. So in order to maintain a strong, unified country, you two, the couples, you guys have to remain intact, if not for yourselves, for your child, because he is the face of the future. Absolutely, right? At the same time, the reason I like this novel so much is there is actually a family that the judge divorced many years ago, and the children of that couple really suffered. And at one point, he regrets issuing that divorce because the children suffered so much. I think you really touch upon that really well. Yes, there is a sense in the novel that the children, because they are the future of the nation and because they represent the future of the nation, that they have to be taken care of. There is that as well, and that would be the correct reading. At the same time, I think what Paek does really well is he really shows the suffering of the children themselves, again, from the couple that he divorced many years ago. And I think it's that characterization, that depiction, that portrayal of those children that makes it so real and so close, so familiar to us. So I really like that. So yes, there is the abstract idea of what the children represent, but there's also the realness, the reality of the portrayal of the children that really rings true to me and many, perhaps a lot of other readers outside of North Korea.
And a question about love in the story. So as we mentioned, there's the couple involved who are looking for the divorce, but also juxtaposed with this is the judge and his relationship with his wife. Yes. And they both introduce both their young ages and their courtship. And the courtship runs, at least for me as a reader, I'm not sure how you looked at it, but it was very innocent, almost 1950s America kind of thing, where yes. you meet someone, you look at them from a distance, and then you propose your love straight away in these grand ways. And it seemed to speak to this innocent, natural idealism almost.
Absolutely. So there is that kind of innocence and purity to their love and their courtship, almost to the point where you would never really find that in any Western, capitalist country. But you know what? In K-drama, you might still see that once in a while, right? So I don't think it's completely alien to what we know of as courtship. But yes, there is an absolute sense of purity. And I love that because from that, I think a lot of the writers in North Korea, they become really creative. In other words, one of my favorite scenes is the husband, before he gets married to his wife, the main character, he falls in love with her. And in order to express his love, he gets down on the floor and he starts to write these letters. And he's really frustrated with himself because he doesn't want to write a cheesy love letter, but he doesn't want to sound stupid. So he's crossing out words, trying to find better words. And if it doesn't sound right, he crosses it all out and he just, crumples up the paper. It's that level of frustration. He wants to express himself, but he really doesn't know how to express himself. I think for the most part, many of us have endured that or experienced that at one point. And another scene that I really, really enjoy is the judge, as you mentioned, when he was courting his wife. He goes out to the train station to see her. She's about to leave. He helps her into the train with her luggage. And at the end, he doesn't really know her. She doesn't really know him. They just know each other on a name basis. And he doesn't know whether he should shake her hand, give her a hug. It's that awkwardness. And, in the end, he just goes, all right, I'll see you later. And he gets off the train and he's waving to her and she's waving back. But the funny part about this is the train doesn't leave yet. So it's this awkward moment of, I'm waving a little too much now. And so he digs his hand into his pocket and he looks away as if nothing has happened. A very nonchalant kind of thing. I mean, I think we've all experienced this kind of embarrassment in front of the other person that we're trying to court or we like. So it's 1950s, but it's still something very familiar to us, right? So I like it a lot. And I think Friend is unique in the sense that unlike other North Korean literature, it really shows this kind of this experience that almost everyone has had. So I really, really enjoyed those two scenes. Yeah.
So on that question of typical, I might get to ask a couple of broader questions about the history of this now. So as you mentioned, the book is 1988. And of course, it's very hard to read. I'm not sure how it was for you, but for me, it's very hard to read the book without thinking of the broader context. And I kept thinking, despite people telling me throughout the years of how subtle and how important some of the North Korean literature is, I kept thinking this is going to be blunt force. And yet I was turning the pages, and there was no mention of Kim Il-sung. There was no mention of Juche and self-reliance. And I wonder I'm assuming this is a change in the style of the prose, that it's much less overt. And as you said as well, even the end of the story and a lot of the turns in the story, it's quite ambiguous. It's not hitting you over the head with this. It is kind of subtle and leaving a lot open for the reader to find for themselves.
Right, and you touch upon a very, very good point. So there are common misconceptions about North Korean literature, and one of them really is that all literature has to praise the great leader or mention the party or anything of that sort. This is actually not true. And if we look at a lot of the earlier works in North Korean literature, all the way dating back to the 50s and 60s, Kim Il-sung is hardly mentioned. Now, don't get me wrong. He's mentioned. Some writers actually write about him, and they put him in, the narrative. And sometimes Kim Il-sung comes out as the main character, or a side character, or like a Deus ex machina kind of character. Whatever it is, some people still mention him, but it's not. It's not like the way we think of it, where almost every literature has to have the leaders in the story. And this shift of putting the leaders in the story really happened in the late 60s and early 70s. And even then, not all writers would talk about the leader. And so that's a very common misconception. And, I would hope that your listeners would understand that, yes, not all literature in North Korea has to have the leaders as a central figure. And clearly in Friend, Kim Il-sung is not mentioned. Kim Jong-il is not mentioned. The party is mentioned. And I want to touch upon this for a second. So the judge, when he's younger, he courts his wife. And after several trials, he finally wins her over. And it's the night of their wedding. And everyone, friends and family, everyone is sitting around. And the best man stands up and he gives a speech. And of course, in the speech, he does a very formal speech, meaning he mentions the party, how the party has blessed this couple by bringing them together and blah, blah, blah. But what's really interesting about this is if there were any other literature, that speech would be like a central focus, and everyone would be attentive to it. Everyone would, enjoy that speech. In fact, the speech will be said in full. But in the novel, as he's speaking, the best man, and as he's mentioning the party, it drifts off. And the guests at that wedding, they're just tired, especially the children. They're like, oh my gosh, I just want to eat. Oh my gosh. And they're like, oh, when is this going to be over? And to me, that's brilliant, right? So for me, when people say, North Korean literature, it's all about the leaders and about the party. Yes, to a certain extent. However, when the party is mentioned, we have to be careful and we have to watch out. How is it mentioned? When is it mentioned? When the leaders are mentioned, again, in what context are they mentioned? So in Friend, yes, the party is mentioned, but how it's mentioned is far more interesting to me.
So on a similar note, there is what seems to run through a lot of this. I'm not sure how you saw as well. Was I suppose the first question, before I get to that question, we should go back to the context here, because I'm about to ask questions about the work that these people do. But of course, as you write in your introduction and your edit here, this work or Friend, you can't read it without the context. You have to understand the period in which Paek Nam-Nyong came about as a writer, and this is a period of these two major national movements, the Three Revolutions movement and the Speed Campaign. And you write here, suddenly there was a focus on people to re-educate themselves. There was technology and culture and everything was trying to move fast. So it was a move away from simply hard work towards a more technical focused work. So I might get it as a first question. Just talk about that period and that change, and then I might build us into some of the questions about the text and the place of work within the novel itself.
Right, absolutely. So in the 60s, late 50s and into the 60s, there was this whole national reconstruction, and it called on the people to come out use their hands, get their hands dirty, and rebuild the country. After all, this is your country. So there was that wide movement of national reconstruction, and everyone was pretty much on board according to the literature and the propaganda. Okay, and then we get into the 70s, and the country realized, whoa, the other countries are economically they're far better than we are. We got to do something else. We cannot do the same stuff that we've been doing for the past 20, 30 years. So we got to be technologically more advanced. So they came up with the three revolutions. And so the three revolutions are ideology, technology, and culture. So the ideology is pretty clear. Kim Il-sung is a great leader, Juche, and so forth. The technology is interesting, right? So the country shifted to manual labor, away from manual labor to more technologically advanced labor, right? So it was a movement where instead of picking rice with your bare hands, now you have this huge tractor that will do 10 people's jobs. And whoever could create that kind of machinery is a true hero of the country, and so forth. So that was like the ambiance of the 1970s. Well, Paek really picks up on this because number one, he was a factory laborer. He was a factory worker. He toiled with his hands. And he never really he never really experienced the technological revolution. And so his novel is really interesting because the husband is a lathe operator. And it's really interesting because I never knew what a lathe operator was. I had to Google this and do some research on it. But after doing some research, I figured, these guys are basically working their hands. It's heavy machinery. And that's what Paek used to do. And because he needs to comply to the national campaigns, he made one of his characters fall behind the times while his wife was really advancing. So there's this disconnect between his wife and himself. And that's where the tension really occurs. So yeah, if you know the context of the 1970s and 80s, then the novel makes a lot more sense, or not so much a lot more sense, but it just, you can appreciate the depth of another layer of this, the novel.
And of course, another layer in that, through that work that we've been speaking about, is the honesty in some of this labor. There is a big juxtaposition here between a couple of the characters. So the wife and the husband, of course, are deeply devoted to their work. It's not always openly said, but they're both coming home late. One is a singer now, one is a lathe operator, as you said, and he is out there. First, he meets his wife by going to a factory and teaching her, and now he spends his nights trying to develop new machinery. When we meet the judge for the first time, he's out of the courtroom when he's a younger man. He's presenting his dissertation to a classroom of people. His wife is always away over the mountains, developing new technology. And these characters, and of course, the most important character in this is the humble school teacher who's so devoted to her work, who cares about everything all the time. And then on the other side of this is this fat man, this Che Rim, who's trying to get them divorced, and the director of the music studio who just wants them to get divorced so his protege can sing better now. So I might get asked a question about that idea of honesty in work and this disconnect that he draws really firmly between these characters.
Absolutely. So, yes, many of his characters still are part of that 1960s movement where, hey, look, if I work with my hands, get my hands dirty, if I'm sweating, that is a sign of good work. That is a sign of a loyal citizen of the state. Sure, there's no doubt. But what the people have to realize is, well, by the 70s and 80s, we're talking about these young kids who are well-educated and trained, who are coming up the ranks and taking over these old people's jobs by sheer technology, not by any experience. So in North Korean literature, there's a lot of tension between the older generation and the younger generation, much like we see here in the United States and in Korea, that where a younger generation is coming up right out of college. They get the latest technology. Many of them are working in IT or whatnot. and they're filling up these spaces. And, my father's generation, the generation of the Korean War, these guys no longer have a place in today's society almost, right? So they're sort of set to the margins. And in Friend, we see this dichotomy of the two groups. And good work is really about, well, on the one hand, good work is laboring. On the other hand, good work is also how do you do this efficiently, right? Efficiency is very important, in your heart and so forth. So yeah, he shows these different types of people and different types of workers, and it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I was about to mention one more thing, but I'm sure we can get into the characters a little later.
Yeah, sure. Also, on that same thing, as you were saying that, I think to myself, there's another tension running through all this, and this is an important one, and that's household tension and the role of women. And so these women are all out there working just as hard as the men, and yet a significant gripe, which comes through all of this, is the lack of time that the judge's wife spends at home, as well as the husband who's about to get divorced from his wife, who's not at home cleaning, cooking, ironing clothes, and preparing meals for him and the family. This is a constant concern of it, and it's interesting how both sides take it. The husband who's asking for a divorce, it just becomes gradually more and more bitter. But the judge, he's also furious about this. It makes him very angry. But
Absolutely.
He seems to have an ability to brush it off a little bit better.
Absolutely. So in North Korean literature, you have this dual labor that women go through, right? So the first labor is they go out into the workforce and they're working all day. And when they come home, they're also expected to do the cleaning and cooking and so forth, right? So again, it really dates back to the 1950s, right? I mean, we're talking about this expectation of women to do household duties whilst working out in the workforce. So by the 80s and into the 90s, you get a lot of women saying, no, we don't want to do this. And not only we don't want to do this, why should we do this? Why can't you help out a little bit? Talking to the men, talking to the husband. So you have the sense of women trying to be, you have women who are vocal and they're saying to their husbands, no, you have to help out as well. In the case of the judge's wife, Eun-ok, she's one of my favorite characters in all of North Korean literature because she only appears at the end, right?
Yes.
She comes home from her 20-day field research trip, and she comes home, and all of a sudden, when the judge comes home, he notices that she's doing all these household work, like cooking and cleaning. And he's thinking, what is she doing? Well, she's doing this because she feels bad that she's been away from home for 20 days, but she's also doing this because she has to go again. She has to leave again. In fact, she has to leave in a couple of days. So her guilt is really coming in, but it's clear that her heart is more at her work than at home. So for me, she is one of the most fascinating characters. If it were any other North Korean literature, she would be doing both. She would go out into the field and come back and do the housework, raise the children, but she doesn't do that. And what's interesting about Friend is the judge gripes about how he raised his son, and so forth. So it's just absolutely fascinating, the role of the women, and how they are contesting this notion of, why do I have to do the housework as well, right? So yes, it's absolutely fascinating.
And there's also a question on the other side of all this hard work. I mentioned two characters there that don't seem to be working as hard, or they seem to be as especially the character Chae-rim, which is the larger man who comes in and is trying to get his cousin a divorce here. And he is he's a manicured guy with nice suits, and he's got his hair done nicely. And he's put forward here almost, it seems like an internal enemy of sorts, someone to worry about inside, because the judge soon finds out that he has been likely embezzling funds, and that's the reason the husband has had to suffer so much in the factory, that he didn't win the prize he should have got. And it seems to be a constant theme, at least running through some of it, that for all this hard work, and it's so important and so gallant, there's always the possibility of internal enemies of sorts. The phrase that comes in the book a couple of times that the judge uses to describe Cherim is a leech.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a good point. So up to, I would say, like the late 60s, early 70s, the absolute enemy of the state was either the Japanese or the Americans or the South Koreans. And toward the mid to late 70s and well into the 80s, the enemy is not so much external, it's internal. People who have the potential to disrupt the harmony of the state. And by that, we mean people who have bourgeois tendencies. This is North Korea, right? So people who have bourgeois tendencies, capitalist-minded people, people who love luxury over the simplicity of life. Again, the very description of Cherim, the cousin. And so he represents all the evils of what North Koreans are accusing the enemy of. And another aspect that's really interesting is that by the 70s and 80s, criticizing the upper management or the executive level is pretty commonplace at this point. So it's not unusual to find literature that criticizes supervisors, managers, or whatnot for their excessive lifestyle, right? So yes, Cherim is a typical what North Koreans would say cadre, right? So at the upper echelon, who's supervising and overlooking people below him. And what happens to these people is, well, they become very bureaucratic and they become too comfortable in their air-conditioned office, right? So that's exactly Cherim. But what's interesting, and this is where Paek Nam-Nyong takes it one step further, is embezzlement of funds. I've really never encountered any North Korean literature that goes into that kind of specificity of you're bad because you're not just bad because you exhibit all these bourgeois capitalist tendencies. You're bad because you're actually stealing money. And I've never actually seen that or read that in North Korean literature up to this point. Yeah.
And again, on the theme runs quite strong, this idea of work and working for the nation. And I wonder how you see this theme playing out. This is the idea of not just working for the nation. The husband at one point gets angry with his wife and says, "You may insult me, but don't insult the fruits of my labor. Don't mock my sacred purpose." There is a wonderful moral distinction, and it's kind of blurred as all this book is, which is interesting to think about, which is this husband who's working incredibly hard. He's trying to develop this new multi-spindle tool, again, something I can't picture in my own head, but he's trying to develop, he's trying to further the nation through just those means. And his wife keeps belittling him and saying, "You should be going to college. You're just going to be a lathe worker forever." And he keeps saying things which you would imagine would be great messages for a country. The idea of this is my purpose in life. I'm doing so well. I'm working for my country. I don't need prizes. And yet the judge at the end comes in and gives him a bit of a scolding towards the end and says, "You've missed what your wife's trying to tell you. She wants you to improve yourself, not because she can't live with a man who's not, but because she loves you and she wants you to improve." This idea of love and self-improvement through work I might get to touch on.
Yeah. So again, the husband is of that older generation where he thinks that, hey, as long as I toil, that is a sign of genuine, genuine and authentic worker. Yeah, that's the old style of thinking, right? And the wife is saying, yeah, again, I'm not discrediting you for working hard, but you can be far more efficient if you just go to college and get this kind of technical training. Because what he's, as you said, he's drawing up this blueprint of a multi-spindle or whatever it is. but he's always drawing it clumsily, like almost as if some elementary school kid is drawing up some kind of blueprint. Why? Because he was never trained, and all he's been doing is manually turning the lathe. So with someone with that kind of experience and that kind of knowledge, you can't expect him to create this huge machine. And so the wife is saying, look, if you take some night classes, if you go to these colleges, they will train you and they can help you be more efficient with the blueprints and all that, which makes a lot of sense. And, in typical North Korean literature, whenever the husband says, look, my labor is, or don't belittle the fruits of my labor, I'm doing this for the country, that's usually a good sign. And everyone else would say, oh, yes, of course, you're right. And just heed to whatever he's saying. But in this novel, that's not good enough, right? Your manual labor is simply outdated and it's just no longer efficient. And what our country needs is not hardworking people like you, but more efficient workers. And you're not one of them. And that's where the judge steps in and says, listen to your wife. She knows what she's talking about. And that's where it gets really interesting.
There's also a really interesting question in some of that of North Korean children and North Korean ideals of what they see their children to be, not as they being sort of an inherent morality to them. So the young child in all of this, there's this wonderful scene when Chae-rim meets the wife and they sit down and Chae-rim starts saying to him things like, you have to divorce your husband. He's such an idiot. Get away from him. And at one point, her son stands up hearing this happen and say, go home, take your bread with him. You have no respect for family. If you're family, then why are you telling my dad and my mum to leave my dad? It's almost like an adult scolding of this negative character. And it feels a lot throughout this that the children are not just need protection, but they instinctively have a moral idea about what the nation should be inside them.
Yeah. I don't think you're wrong. I think there is a sense of this moral compass within the children. And for me, when Chae-rim was insulting the husband and the son is standing up for her husband, it just really shows this kind of the child's desire for family unity. And I think the mother really understood that as well. And that's why it really breaks her heart every time her son defends his dad. And not only that, to add insult to injury, her son resembles his dad. So even if they do get a divorce and she gets a child custody, she'll still see the face of her husband in her child every day, right? So it's like she divorced her husband, but she still sees the husband in her child. But going back to the child, he's a pretty interesting character as well. He, the first time he meets the judge, he's sick. He's been standing out in the rain. The judge takes him to his apartment, washes him, bathes him, and gives him cold medicine. Later, the parents come to pick up the child from the judge's apartment. But the judge has prepared dinner, and the child, he's sitting there eating because the judge offered him the food. So out of just basic courtesy, he's going to eat the food. But then he looks up at his parents to get permission whether he should continue eating or not. And that part really broke my heart. I mean, like that look, because the child, he's a child, but he still understands what's going on in the adult world, right? Yeah. And so, he's looking around to see, who should I lean to? Who should I, can I do this? Is this like socially acceptable to do this? And so forth. In another scene, there's this one scene where he can't sleep, so he is up all night, midway between where his mother's sleeping in the bedroom and his father sleeping in the other room, and he's stuck in the middle because he doesn't know which one to choose. I think these moments are very familiar moments to maybe a lot of the readers because the child, although age-wise and size-wise, he might be a child, but things that are the things that he's thinking is far more bigger, right? It's bigger than it really is. And he's really trying to understand this situation that he's forced to be in, and it's not fair to him, right? And yeah, it's really heartbreaking to see a lot of the moments whenever children are presented in the novel.
I'm fascinated just to hear how you saw the character of the school teacher. This is a woman in there who flitters into the novel a couple of times throughout the story. And she's always put forward as, and I'm going to quote here, pure, dignified, honest, who valued the worth of her students, her nobility of her occupation. She sacrificed in her life and all this kind of stuff. And she's this character that stands on her doorstep waiting for her alcoholic, or at least a heavily drinking husband to return each night. And then they seem to argue and she's bitter, but they also seem quite happy as well. The husband kind of says, this is who I am. And it's very ambiguous about what their relationship is like. But she seems to be almost like a moral core to this story. This person who's completely self-sacrificed in all aspects of her life. And even at one point approaches the judge and says something like, I can see you're having a hard time. It must be another divorce case. So she kind of instinctively understands the pressure he's going through.
Absolutely. And she is supposed to be that infallible character that is present in typical North Korean literature. In other words, there's no fault in this woman. And if you want to have an idea of what an ideal woman, ideal heroine, an ideal wife should be, it's probably the school teacher, right? And so she in that sense, she's very interesting, but unsurprising. I've read many times people like the school teacher. What makes her interesting is how she has to correct the judge at times and say, I don't agree with that divorce that you did many years ago. And she's correcting a judge and his sense of judgment and his sense of morality. And for her, the nation is important. Absolutely. And it's represented by her work with the children, because the children are the representation of the future of the country. We can read it like that. But again, I think she has the more human touch, where she realizes that she has this one kid in her class whom the judge has divorced his parents many years ago, and the kid is suffering and he's not doing well. And she hates the state for divorcing this kid's parents, because the ramifications is, well, look, the kid is just not doing well. He's socially inept, and he just can't seem to get along with any other schoolmates. She's looking at the student at a more human level, and I in that sense, I'm appreciative of her character. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, she would be one of those typical 1960s, 1970s moral character that is prevalent in North Korean literature.
Now, before we move on to the author himself in some detail, there is one thing that you put in your introduction, which is a really interesting thought, which didn't occur to me when I was reading the novel at first. I read the novel first and then went back and read your introduction and just get your take on it. And it was an interesting thought, because the morality is ambiguous. The turns, it's not really sure. Of course, there's people like the judge who are central moral figures who tell people what they should do and what they shouldn't do, and seems to have this concern and this worry. But it's never obvious that once you learn something, once you're told something, you should get it. And that's what you write here. You write, no political ideology can force individuals to love and live happily ever after. And this focus on party ideology and family unit. And so you're writing here that in this novel, he's being very particular about not just love, but party ideology, that it has to be subtle. It has to slip under the surface of subconsciousness almost. You can't just bash someone over the head with it, and you can't just tell someone ideology and they say, okay, that's truth. It has to be a lot more subtle.
Right. So what's interesting is the entire novel shows the individual's willingness to go out of their way to court someone and fall in love with someone. And then the trouble comes when when the couple wants to get divorced, because it's their right and their freedom to date whoever they want, fall in love with whoever they want, but it's not their right to divorce, because now you're under the purview of the state. And this is where it really troubles the wife, the main character, she believes that she is entitled to the freedom to divorce, and then she runs up against the wall. And so, but what's interesting is because of that, right? Because you're free to love anyone you want, and you choose to marry whomever you want in North Korea. The next jump or the next assumption is, well, that naturally means love in North Korea means also loving the state and loving the leader wholeheartedly without any question. For me, that's a huge jump. And whenever I read North Korean literature, the characters express their love for the country, for the state, for the party, for the leader, and so forth. And it is almost like ideology being, hit over your head, and you must recite these certain phrases, and everyone is sort of trained to speak in such a way. Hence, everyone is trained to think in a certain way. But friend is very different for me, right? So, this notion of having to love the country and the state is not that apparent. And this notion of, everyone has to recite a certain kind of propaganda, or what we would call propaganda, is really non-existent in Friend. And that is a very interesting aspect of the novel. This notion of love is very difficult to talk about in the context of North Korea because because of many social political reasons, people don't like to talk about it openly. And the writers certainly have a difficult time talking about this kind of erotic love. And it's always about this kind of this logos love, this kind of this unconditional love for the state, and that overshadows personal love. But in Friend, I beg to differ. I believe that this kind of erotic personal love is the central kind of drive in this entire narrative.
Well, let's dig into some personal stories then, because I was really interested to read that you had actually met the author, Paek Nam-Nyong. So I might get you to introduce how it came about that you traveled to North Korea in 2015 and managed to meet the author.
Yeah, so I had to ask around different tour agencies and ask them, look, I've already been to North Korea in the past. I don't need to go on a tour anymore. Can you arrange something with this author? And I've asked like 3 different agencies, and they pretty much came back saying, no, we can't do that. We can't arrange that. One of the agencies came back and said, look, why don't you contact this group in California, this Korean American group. They might be able to help you. So I contacted the group, and they were able to arrange something. I went to North Korea blindly without any kind of itinerary, which is pretty typical when you go to North Korea. And, I met Paek Nam-Nyong for one day, and that was it on our schedule. We were supposed to do other touristy things. But then Paek Nam-Nyong requested to see me for 2 more days, and that wasn't in the itinerary. So I've had the pleasure of spending 3 full days, lunch and dinner, playing ping pong, and going to coffee shops, going to like karaoke bars with this guy. Mm-hmm. So it was absolutely fascinating, and his generosity was just beyond gracious. So yeah, that's how I got to North Korea, and we talked about tons of stuff, and of course mainly about Friend.
So how was it talking to the author about his own novel? This is a fascinating little thought experiment that you traveled there and actually spoke to the author on this. So I wonder, did you get any takes on his own thoughts about the novel, or was it a little bit too old in the mind? And I wonder how the author saw his own novel after, what would it be, almost 20 odd years later?
Yeah, so he was fascinated that someone from the United States, a Korean American, has come to him. But the novel was originally the novel was published in 1988. In 1992, it went to South Korea. So he was aware of that. And it was quite popular in South Korea in 92. And then 2000 something, a French Korean scholar comes to visit him in North Korea and asks him if he could translate it into French. And it was translated and published in France, and it did quite well. And now this Korean American kid comes to him and says, "Hey, I'm going to translate your work." So he was really fascinated, and I believe he was really moved by that. So we spent quite some time together talking about his work, and I basically told him my reading and my take of the novel. And he he couldn't agree with everything I said because I had my guide standing or sitting next to us. So there were some things that I can tell he wanted to say but couldn't say.
Yes,
and that's fine. I'm fine with that. So I was the one who kept on talking. But then what's interesting is, so I sent. Before I met him, I sent in about 50 some odd questions as these interview questionnaires prior to my visiting. And when I got there, he pulled out an envelope for about more than 60 pages of his typed out answers, right? So he was very generous to answer all my questions typed out. And so now I was able to take it back to the States with me. And half of about half of the questions were about his personal life. Another third of the questions was about his writing stories, novels, and particularly Friend. And the last section, maybe last 15-20% of it, was about his political life. And I was very careful to ask him about that. And it's interesting. He hardly answered. He would answer in one sentence answer. He would give me one sentence answers like, how is it working at the writers union? He would say, "It's great." And that's about it, right? Whereas when I asked him about his personal life, he would write pages and pages about, his childhood, the things that he used to like doing as a child, his best friends at school, the teachers whom he hated, and things like that. And he would talk about his first girlfriend. Oh my God, that went on for multiple pages. So, for me, what was interesting was I was able to connect with him on a very personal level because of this notion of love, right? Everything based around personal, individual love. And, when I told him about this and my reading of Friend and how it's based on this kind of love, again, he couldn't say it, but I think he wanted to say something about it. But I could sort of tell just by looking at his face, So, I'm just going to have to take that as a sign of positivity. Like I read his work correctly, kind of thing.
So on that same topic, this is so interesting to me, this idea of this personal aspect, because reading through the novel and reading your introduction, there were a few moments I thought, okay, the author is really deep into the story himself here. And you mentioned a few things that also got me going. The idea of he's still years later thinking about this old girlfriend of his. You think to yourself, this is there in the novel, but there's so many other things. You write that the story is based around this steel worker on a lathe. And that's what he was early in his youth. There's a moment that you write that at one point his wife dies of brain cancer, leaving him alone with 3 children. So the idea of the household duties must have been huge to him as well. The school teacher, you write, he writes in the story that the school teacher's parents were killed in an American bombing raid during the Korean War, and so she had to grow up without love. And that happened to his parents during the war. And on a very last one here, the idea of divorce, he used to work in the Zhejiang Province Writers Union, which was on a floor above the story of the municipal court, which handled the civil cases. So he saw this every day. So
every day.
Am I reading this wrong, or is there a huge amount of the author?
Wow. Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think you really understood the novel. And for me, I appreciated the novel that much more because after talking with Paek, I made all those connections that you just made, right? And it just made the novel come to life. right? So it wasn't just an imagination of Paek's. This was a reality, right? So it made it made the reading and the translating of the novel that much more exciting and personal, right? So no, I think you're absolutely correct in making those connections.
So a final question on the author, at least. What is he doing today? Is he retired, or is he still a member of the April 15th Literary Unit, which I suppose we should introduce as well? What is he doing now with his life?
Well, he's still writing. He recently sent me a letter and asking me if I was doing well, and that he's quite busy with writing, and that he recently I'm not sure if he recently published it or it's about to get published, but he's working on something that he thinks will do quite well as well. And so yeah, it was a very friendly letter, and I'm really looking forward to reading his latest novel.
And will we get access to the latest novel? Is it going to be released to the wider world, or is it going to be?
No. It'll probably be just in Pyongyang. Oh yeah,
yes. So we have to wait for someone to smuggle it out, I suppose.
Right, exactly, exactly.
A couple of final questions about yourself and how you enjoyed the novel or found yourself in the novel. The first one is, I wonder how difficult it was for you to disassociate the text from the context. It's such a hard thing to do with North Korean literature, I have to assume. But you have so many thoughts going through your head reading a novel like this about the broader surrounds of North Korea. And one of the things that just exploded in my mind was a couple of moments they mentioned food, and they talk about his one of the school children was sad because he only had rice and spinach. This is 1988, and you think to yourself, 6 years, the famines are going to come. And it's very hard to get the context out of your head. So I wonder how you managed to do that, or whether you did.
I was able to do that. It wasn't that difficult because, again, I knew, for me, North Korea is not clouded by the famine and the arduous march and the military and so forth that we associate with today. Because I've been reading North Korean literature from the 50s, 60s, all the way up to the 90s, you get a very good sense of how the country has moved over the years and shifted. And the more you understand the previous decades, actually knowing the previous decades help a lot more than knowing what's about to come, right? So, when I was translating the novel, Nam-Nyong would use in the Korean, he would use a lot of the same phrases and tropes that were used in the 1970s. So because I was very familiar with the 1970s literature, I was immediately able to go back and make that connection with the 70s and translate it so that it would make sense for the North Korean readers. I know they won't read it in English, but so that it will make sense for the North Korean readers that this was talking about the 1970s. Of course, Paek would not have known 6 years later that there would be a famine, right? And there's just no way of knowing that, right? So I don't think there was any kind of prophecy in the novel, but there's a sense of, we get a little glimpse of energy conservation in the novel, and that's really interesting to me. So there's a moment in the novel where a supervisor of this electric company is going to be charged and sentenced because he illegally used an electric blanket, and basically he stole electricity from the state. Something that we would think that's quite strange, but I guess electricity is state-owned, so if you steal it, you're charged with a crime. And this is interesting because when we get to the 90s and the famine and the arduous march and whatnot, everyone's trying to conserve something, right? Food, energy. Even when I was in North Korea for a week, there was at least 4 blackouts. So this energy conservation is always constantly in North Korean people's minds, not only post the famine, but even prior to that, right? So this notion of having to save energy is something that's really urgently in North Korean mind. So I think that was in the novel to reflect the reality of what the North Koreans were thinking at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, that. As a final question, as you said, you've done a lot of work with North Korean literature, done a lot of translation. So as a final question, why did this book stand out so much? Why was this the book that stood out from the pack, so to speak? So yeah, as a final look, why is Friend such an important literary novel that's come out of North Korea?
Right. Well, number one, the title is probably the most boring. Okay, out of everything, right? So there's nothing more commonplace than just friend. Originally, it was supposed to be titled Our Friend, but Paek Nam-Nyong decided to take out the hour and just keep friend. Was that a good move? You know what? That's sort of an inconsequential move that he made, right? But regardless of that, he thought friend would be a better title. No, what made this novel so unique to me was the opening. As soon as I started reading, typical North Korean literature would, give you the setting, the environment, all this natural scenery, and so forth. No. So by the mid 1980s, or even like early 1980s, there's a shift in narrative style. So instead of introducing this kind of boring natural landscape and how hot it is in the autumn season or whatever it is. No, in this novel, it gets right to the action, right? There's a woman who's waiting for the judge because she wants a divorce. And the action is right there in your face. And I love the beginning, but I also love the ending. And the ending is ambiguous. And this is very unlike any North Korean literature, because typical North Korean literature, if there is conflict, you have to resolve the conflict. In this novel, the conflict is not resolved, and it's ambiguous. Now, it could just be my reading, but because it was my reading and my take on it, I really enjoyed the novel. The third aspect is characterization. A lot of these characters are far more rounded than typical North Korean characters. Even the judge, who is the main character, and he's supposed to be this infallible socialist revolutionary. No, he has his problems. He has his shortcomings. In fact, every character, I would say, excluding the school teacher, has their shortcomings. So I really appreciate that kind of characterization because I can relate to these people far more than infallible characters. Fourthly, Paek Nam-Nyong writes beautifully, by the way. His prose is unbelievable. So I was able to enjoy just his prose. The dialogue was intriguing because he actually uses curse words. He actually uses like really heated. There's a lot of tension in the dialogue, and that's rather unusual. So I thought, wow, it really brings to life the characters and the situation. And I realized how familiar this whole issue with the couple is, far more than any other North Korean novel. Whenever I read other North Korean novels or short stories, I walk in or I read it and I finish it with the understanding of, yeah, that was a North Korean novel. But this one, I was completely consumed. I was in it, and I was just almost living it through the characters, through the story, and so forth. So it was just absolutely fascinating. For many reasons, I find this novel to be much better than the previous decades.
Well, I have to agree with you as well. I really enjoyed it from my end as well. On that, the novel, of course, we've been talking about today is Friend, and I'm going to link that below so for people to go and read it for themselves. And I really do encourage it. It really is a really interesting read. It flows so well. And of course, I'm also going to link below where you can find Immanuel's other works, other books, as well as his academic profile. So on that, Immanuel Kim, thanks for coming on the Korean podcast.
Wow, Jed, thank you so much. And this was really fun, man. I really enjoyed it, and I wish you the best too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.